Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that's overslept and therefore might miss its top secret rendezvous with an underground car park. My name is Cory Hazelhurst, and my anonymous source is Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Cory.
And this week we're talking about All the President's Men, which celebrates its 50th birthday in April 2026. Now, this is a stone cold classic, often topping many lists of best political films. It's an incredible tale of two underdogs uncovering one of the biggest scandals in political history. It's inspired many who've watched it to become journalists. It stars two of the greatest actors of their generation, if not of all time. Surely, Mark, no one who's a fan of political fiction can have anything but praise for this incredible story. Who could possibly have any objection to it? Well, listeners, and I say this more in sorrow than anger, it turns out I'm talking to one of them right now.
Correct.
Those listeners who are good at inference will realise that when we get to the first item of our agenda events, dear boy, that yes, Mark has seen this before, as indeed have I. I had seen it probably not for a few years, I don't think.
I had sort of backed into seeing the film originally in a slightly odd way, in that I first picked up a secondhand copy of the sequel to All the President's Men, which was originally a book turned into a film. There was then a sequel to that book, The Final Days, that covers, as the name suggests, the last few years of the Nixon administration. And so from the sequel to the book, I then got into the book and hence the film. And yeah, I guess I've seen it a good handful of times over the years since.
I originally bought it on DVDs, and obviously younger listeners will have to ask their grandparents about what DVDs were. And yeah, I suppose the fact that there's a sequel to the book
Mm.
makes sense because actually the ending is very odd because this is about Watergate. It's based, as you say, based on the book between Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein. It's not really about the whole Watergate scandal itself. It's more sort of about how the reporters uncover the story. And so I find the end essentially covers about 18 months by typewriters clacking for about a minute, which makes more sense when you realise that part of the reason this film comes out is almost to promote the later book, I suppose.
I think it's a film that very much assumes, like this podcast is assuming, that people know the basic contours of the story. And yeah, Watergate is so famous that we've not had to particularly go into how this is about 1970s America when Richard Nixon is a Republican president and there's this scandal in a building called Watergate, all of that sort of stuff. I think we can safely assume that listeners to the podcast are likely to be familiar with. And absolutely anyone producing a film to come out just a couple of years after that scandal could assume that people will know the basics. And so there is remarkably little exposition in many ways of the overall story. And as you say, it ends somewhat sharply on the day of Richard Nixon's inauguration, which is very much not a natural endpoint of the story if you're telling it in any other way.
One of the things we're going to have to be careful of when recording this is not making this a podcast about Watergate, but it's a podcast about All the President's Men, because they are sort of two quite different things, aren't they?
Oh yes.
And if
you're gonna let me do my rant at some point, aren't you?
Eventually, hold your horses, Mark. The all in good time. I found Slate's Slow Burn series they did on Watergate a few years ago. Probably quite a decent place to start if you need the sort of the contours of it. Given that as many things like Watergate was very much a TV spectacle, there's the Gore Vidal quote, isn't there, about I need to get my daily fix of Watergate. And so I wonder if part of the reason the film is made how it is because, as you say, they assume that the viewers have either got tired of all of the TV sort of drama of it and they almost wanted to get back to the source of the book. As you say, Watergate, there's a burglary, they look into the burglary, turns out Richard Nixon burglarized the building. That's basically all you need to know, isn't it?
Interestingly, one of the details that is still very much a loose end is why were the burglars burgling that building? What were they trying to do? For all of the huge amounts of information we've learned in the decades since, the question of what were the burglars up to is still a bit of a mystery. Although the fundamental picture of an awful lot of extremely dodgy and often illegal activities being carried out on behalf of Richard Nixon obviously is well known and well established. And I guess what the film is doing in a way is what the book itself did. So the blurb on the back of the original edition of All the President's Men, when it sort of came out, the book's dust jacket said, "All America knows about Watergate. Here, for the first time, is the story of how we know." And it's that sense of, okay, you know the basic story. I'm now going to tell you something within that story.
A bit of a clunky segue from Richard Nixon to Margaret Thatcher. When we did The Iron Lady, that's not the only Margaret Thatcher themed film we're going to talk about or TV series we're going to talk about. I imagine that we could probably spend an entire year of the podcast doing Watergate based TV shows and films.
And actually, what All the President's Men, I think, does a lot better than The Iron Lady, the Thatcher film that we've talked about, is the Thatcher film sort of shoehorns in various key moments and then doesn't really expand and tell on them, which makes it for a slightly unsatisfactory viewing experience. Here in All the President's Men, they're quite brutal at just focusing on the drama of the two reporters and what's happening to them. And so there are a lot of key moments that just get left out of the film.
There is no mysterious milk in this film. There is no kind of element which is hinted at and then not explored. It's either completely junked or Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman are knocking on its door. They're calling up the milk. They're explaining to the milk that they won't get quoted in the papers. They're meeting the milk in underground car parks with a kind of weird blue sheen, all of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Dear listener, I have no idea what he was on about.
That metaphor completely works. So we should probably move on, though, to our second item of the agenda, All the President's Men, confusingly. So we talk about the cast and the crew. As you said, it's based on the book by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who worked for the Washington Post. And again, the film sort of talks about the fact they're quite contradictory figures, aren't they? And they sort of do that by the dress, by the hair, the fact that I think Carl Bernstein was a bit of a smoker, wasn't he? And Dustin Hoffman basically smokes all the way through the film.
And although I guess in subsequent decades, Bob Woodward has probably become the more famous of the two, in that he has carried on writing best-selling books and so on. At the time, they were very much a partnership. And I think it's actually to Robert Redford's huge credit. So he originally sees an incomplete draft of the book, absolutely loves it, buys the rights himself for $350,000. And what he realizes is that for it to work, he's got to be sparring with an actor who is absolutely A-league as well. And hence the recruitment of Dustin Hoffman to the film, which, you know, you can imagine lots of successful people would very much think, no, I'm the big person here. Let's not bring in anyone else to overshadow me. But Robert Redford absolutely gets that it has to be somebody of that caliber to be able to equal and even on occasions in scenes exceed him to make the basic dynamic work. Fun little fact as well, it was released in the same year as Rocky. And somehow that just seems to me really weird that Rocky and All the President's Men are of the same generation. I am glad to say, though, that the public decided that All the President's Men was the film they wanted to see more often. So it did better than Rocky in its first year in the cinemas.
That is interesting. Was Rocky, I don't know, was Rocky more like a slow burn hit? Was it not?
I don't know. Maybe it's just I think Rocky did quite well. It's just All the President's Men did even better.
The lust for justice over the Richard Nixon administration trumps underdog boxers.
We've talked about, the two big name stars, but actually there are two other stars who win Oscars for their roles in the film. So one is Jason Roberts, who wins Best Supporting Actor for his portrayal of Ben Bradley, the newspaper editor. The other, which I think is a brilliant bit of acting, is Jane Alexandra, who wins Best Supporting Actress. And she is on screen only for two short scenes, which are under 7 minutes in total. And the first of those two scenes certainly is a brilliant, brilliant piece of acting, because the quality of her acting tells you so much backstory about her character, how she's interacting with other people, what she's thinking, that you don't need exposition. You don't need lots of other scenes around it. She brilliantly encapsulates so much into that one scene. The other scene that she's in, I should say, she's perfectly good in and impressive, but that first of the two scenes is a real... It did also remind me of my most embarrassingly ignorant experience of watching a film, which is there is one of the versions of Murder on the Orient Express. An actress wins an Oscar for, and there's one scene which is said, this is the scene for which she won the Oscar. When I watched the film, I watched it back a couple of years ago. I decided to watch different versions of Murder on the Orient Express, sort of back to back. consecutive days. I sort of watched it. I thought at the end, I didn't notice anything really Oscar worthy. And even when I looked up which was the scene and I went back and I watched it, I couldn't figure out why it was meant to be good acting. But that's absolutely not the case with Jane Alexander in this film. Really, really well worth watching. My other favourite little detail about the cast is Frank Wills. So he is the real life security guard, or discovers there's a burglary underway at the Watergate Centre and calls law enforcement. Frank Wills is played by Frank Wills in the movie. And even better, the door that he uses is the real door. They have the real man and the real door.
They reunited for one last mission. I have a horrible feeling you've got yourself out of judging any Best Actor or Best Actress Oscars with that little bit. So if you want me to take it out in case you want to be on the judging panel, then let me know.
Let's leave my ignorance of what quality acting looks like exposed for all to hear.
So another nice little cameo is F. Murray Abraham pops up as one of the arresting officers who Frank Wills calls. But I can't honestly say I noticed it was F. Murray Abraham because it's quite dark and he wears one of the most outrageous bucket hats I've ever seen. It's very Henry Blake in MASH, just to, again, have another hip cultural reference for our younger listeners. And rounding off, Hal Holbrook plays Deep Throat. Deep Throat, probably not a film we're going to cover in this podcast.
I think that's a very wise editorial choice.
And directed by Alan Bakula, who did, I think, The Pelican Brief and Sophie's Choice were the two films I noticed.
Interesting. I think it says something about us that I immediately think of him as Clute and Parallax View, because he did have quite a varied career, and perhaps one can sort all of humanity into those people who've never heard of him, those people who think of him and think Parallax View, and those people who have heard of him and think Sophie's Choice.
Oh, yes. Yeah, they talk about the Paranoia trilogy, don't they? Or at least that's what they want you to think.
Very good. Very good.
Next out on the agenda, Art of the Possible. Are there any similarities between this film and real events?
Well, yes and no.
Mark, I have a feeling you have a 13-hour rant planned, so I'm going to go to bed and then I'll edit this in the morning once you're finished.
Dear listener, whatever you end up hearing is only a very shortened, very, very condensed version of what I actually said. Let's start with Raiders of the Lost Ark. And one of the fun things that people like saying about Raiders of the Lost Ark is how irrelevant Indiana Jones actually is to the whole plot. Because if Indiana Jones hadn't been there, the Nazis would have found the Lost Ark, they would have opened the Lost Ark, they would have all died. And sometimes people get a bit really quite worked up about disliking this fun rubbishing of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was popularized in an episode of The Big Bang Theory, and sort of argue, actually, no, there's this secret Nazi submarine base that, that wouldn't have got destroyed had it not been for Indiana Jones. And also sometimes more serious counter arguments are made around how actually the story of that Indiana Jones film is about how he changes as a person. But the basic idea is, here is a story where you think the person in front of you is central to it all, but actually they're not. Which is really what happens in All the President's Men as well. Because the story we're presented with in the film is this is all about these two courageous investigative journalists unearthing a horrendous conspiracy that goes all the way to the top. But think carefully about what they're discovering. And all the way through, what they're discovering are things that the FBI and other law enforcement processes were unearthing. So when they're trying to get hold of records that have been subpoenaed and they're having trouble getting hold of the records because they've been subpoenaed because somebody is already on the case investigating it and looking at the phone records for the evidence they need. And central to this is the question of who Deep Throat is. Now, quite rightly, Woodward and Bernstein at the time needed to keep the identity of their key source secret. But the way they described Deep Throat obviously was a little bit vague because you're protecting your sources. But they described Deep Throat as a, quote, source in the executive branch who had access to information at the committee to re-elect the president, which makes it sound like their source was somebody who knew about the dirty deeds and was leaking information about the dirty deeds. But now we know their source was actually Mark Felt, deputy director at the FBI. So the only things that their source was leaking to them were things that the FBI in their investigations had already discovered. So far from this being a story about two investigative journalists unearthing a big scandal, it's about two investigative journalists telling the story of an investigation that other people are carrying out. And in many ways, although the film makes the two journalists the heroes, Perhaps the real heroes are those FBI officers who were willing to investigate and follow a trail all the way up to the most senior levels of power. Perhaps the real heroes are the members of the special jury who handed down indictments against powerful people. Perhaps the real heroes are even the politicians on the committee in the Senate, the cross-party way, work together and unearth the secret of the bugging of the White House. Perhaps the true heroes are maybe even the Supreme Court for being willing to rule against the incumbent president on a highly controversial matter. And just maybe the lesson that we should have drawn for America in 2026 is about how wonderful it is when a Supreme Court stands up to the president, how wonderful it is when prosecuting authorities are willing to follow through on a prosecution, even if it trails all the way back to the president. Perhaps the lesson is about how great it is when politicians stand up for democracy in a cross-party way. Or maybe we just have to draw the conclusion that it's all about political journalists and the whole world revolves around them.
So I'm just coming back with my morning cup of coffee, having left Mark overnight.
Hello again. You're still there.
Rant. I've just come back. I had a really nice, good night's sleep. I hope yours was as restful. Like Robert Redford in the film, I nearly slept through my alarm and then didn't meet you in this underground car park where you're still talking to random security guards for all the president's men. I suppose there's a few different things. One of them is that obviously with Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's not so much the treasures that you uncover, it's the biplanes that you fly and the snakes that you battle along the way. And so you can still have a very, very absorbing film as this is without, as you say, it being necessarily what the point of the film is. But I suppose there is something about how Woodward and Bernstein were able to keep the story going.
The counterpoint to what I calmly, clearly, persuasively and conclusively laid out a moment ago, one of the counterpoints is there is a period in the summer of 1972 when it looks like the official investigations might be running into the sand. There is a bit of a question about how effective the attempted interference from on high would have been in terms of stopping those investigations. And it's probably true that the ongoing press coverage, of which at that point the Washington Post is, absolutely central because other papers have moved on from the story and not yet come back to it, that there is a period of time when they made some impact. I mean, the other thing, though, that is sort of lost in the film because of when it was made, and therefore we didn't know who Deep Throat was, is Deep Throat himself as a fascinating character. So Deputy Director of the FBI. Now, you might think from what I've said that he's in some way some pro-democracy, sort of small L liberal hero, trying to make sure that powerful forces don't stop the FBI investigation, and he's maybe leaking to the press to help keep that going. But the deep irony is that Mark Felt is known for two things. One is he is the person who leaked information about an illegal burglary and associated wrongdoing. The other is he is the person who was charged, convicted, and then subsequently pardoned for running an illegal burglary operation at the FBI. And so how is this man, who clearly is happy with law enforcement breaking the law, doing dodgy things, how does he end up being the person who's leaking information about the president doing it?
Because he is, after J. Edgar Hoover, he dies, doesn't he, in office as head of the FBI, and Mark Felt's passed over, and they appoint someone else as the head of the FBI. Is it kind of a professional jealousy?
Maybe, but it is weird that he doesn't, in the rest of what we know about his professional career, he doesn't seem to have been a particularly principled man for upholding the rule of law. He seems to have been one of those who's very willing to bend the rules in the way that Nixon was very willing to bend and break the rules in politics.
It is interesting what they include and what they miss out. So as I say, the film is very much about the reporting. It is about Woodward and Bernstein. A lot of women have written out the reporting. So Martha Mitchell isn't included in this at all.
Although we should perhaps say the most prominent woman in this who is written out of the film was written out at her request. So Catherine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post, who in real life was a significant player in the story in terms of being willing to back the editor and his journalists, she said at the time she didn't want to feature in the film. So she is at least written out at her request.
And actually, in terms of lessons for 2026, maybe owners of the Washington Post, just to pick a purely hypothetical example, random newspaper, maybe ought to be backing their journalists rather than sacking a third of them. But again, that's just a purely hypothetical. I suppose talking of Deep Throat, so apparently Deep Throat went to the Post's rival first. They went to the Washington Daily News. And there's other stories it wasn't just Woodward and Bernstein. Seymour Hersh also did a lot of reporting on this, which isn't sort of mentioned. The Pentagon
We should
Papers
perhaps
isn't really.
mention that Seymour Hersh, in his heyday, was a really high quality investigative reporter. His views of the world have taken a curious arc since then, but at the time in the 70s, he was an absolutely top rank investigative journalist.
The other champions in the newspaper were Howard Simons and the city editor Barry Sussman. And what's interesting is that Ben Bradley writes in his memoir that his relationship with Howard Simons, who's the managing editor, wasn't the same after the film comes out, because I suppose Roberts wins the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, as you've said, and it's very much seen as sort of Bradley's story. And the others are sort of, they have a couple of good lines, don't they? But they're very much sort of bit part players. It's very much Bradley leaning on it. The thing that I found most disappointing actually is that Deep Throat's "Follow the Money," which became so iconic, isn't in the book at all. It does quite a good job, I think, of the film about having fictionalized conversations of a lot of the issues the book is talking about that we'll probably get to later. But that there's a kind of editorial meeting in which you've got hardened reporters saying, well, why would Nixon bother bugging, Watergate in the Democratic headquarters when he's so far ahead in the polls? It doesn't make sense. And that attitude was definitely prevalent at the time. And I think they do that quite well. The main fact I wanted to check, a story I'd completely forgotten about Gordon Liddy, putting his hand in the candle, that he'd sort of keep his hand in the candle until the flesh burnt. And he'd say, that, well, the lesson is not to care. And as far as I can tell, it's in his FT obituary. An undersized boy afraid of bullies lifted weights, and to increase endurance, he'd hold his hand in a candle flame. And also eat a rat and decapitate chickens until he could kill without emotion, like a soldier. That's not part of the Labour Party training for new activists. I don't know if that's part of the Lib Dem. Is there a session on bar charts, and in the afternoon you start with the chicken decapitation and the rat eating?
I best not comment.
I think we can all agree what the silence means in that context, listeners. Anything you want to say on any of that?
No, I think we've covered everything there. We can get to the easiest Phil Wallace Award round ever.
Yes. So, who is the most evil or Machiavellian character in this film, Mark?
Richard Nixon. But interestingly, he barely features on screen. So we do get some news clips in which he features, but not very many of those. There's no actor playing him. And I think artistically that works really well, because there is the usual political story about how it's the junior people who are first for the chop. And in a way, the more junior you are in the conspiracy, the more you feature on screen in the film. So in quite a nice way, it brings out that sense of a whole load of people being treated as disposable and as the sort of human shields. And what's happening through the Watergate saga is stripping those away and getting to more and more senior levels. But yeah, it's clearly Richard Nixon.
And again, given that this probably is not the only Watergate-based political fiction we're going to talk about on this podcast, Richard Nixon may well be the winner of the most Phil Wallace's award of all time by the time this podcast is going, which I'm sure he would be thrilled with. Maybe we could find a little golden model of Phil Wallace we could have presented. But anyway, that's I digress. Given you've talked about the archive footage, let's talk about Barack Obama's tan suit and the best and worst bits of political detail in the film. Because there's a lot of real news clips, aren't they? So can I give you my favorite Google rabbit hole I went down as a result of this archive news footage?
Oh, absolutely. Please do.
So one of the bits of news footage is Richard Nixon's renomination from 1972. And he's re-elected 1,347 to 1, which is a quite wonderful vote tally. The one other vote is for Pete McCloskey, who was a member of the House of Representatives. House seat was in California, and his primary race was against Shirley Temple Black. So the Shirley Temple, the child star, and obviously then has this quixotic bid to become president in 1972, ends Pat Robertson's 1988 presidential bid because he says his claims of serving in combat were untrue, and then ends up endorsing John Kerry in the 2004 election. So that was quite an interesting political journey I found out about.
In terms of other bits of detail, I mean, there's so much detail to love. From a production point of view, the favourite bit of detail is that all the newsroom trash, or at least a lot of it, is real. So they took real trash from the Washington Post newsroom and used that as the trash in the newspaper offices. But perhaps the most significant sort of detail that really leapt out at me was early on in the film, the thing that links the bungling burglars at the Watergate Centre with the White House is E. Howard Hunt's name and phone number being found in one of the address books taken on the burglary by the Watergate burglars. And you might watch that and think nobody is that stupid as to, take with them evidence of who the secret person is that they're meant to, not reveal that has been getting them to this burglary. But it's absolutely true. That was the real initial break in that investigation. I guess it's a slightly troubling lesson in a way that sometimes people really are that stupid, and sometimes the really implausible detail where you think, oh no, there's no way anyone would actually do that. Come on, this is a daft conspiracy theory. Actually, no, the conspiracy theory is real.
And should be borne in mind when we get on to our very British coup item of the agenda. Before we do that, though, worst bit of political detail, also from the editorial meeting, it talks about how Queen Elizabeth called a state of emergency to deal. So Queen Elizabeth calls a state of emergency to deal with a Dockland strike, and I was very confused because I didn't realise that she'd overthrown the Heath government and proclaimed absolute rule in the early 70s. But I guess Ted Heath wasn't famous enough to qualify for inclusion in the Hollywood film in 1976.
Yes, it's quite sort of humbling in a way to realise they think it's okay to make up something so completely untrue about Britain in order to explain briefly British politics to people.
Next item on the agenda, a very British coup. Are there conspiracies or conspiracy theories in this film? Well, yes.
Yes, it is a conspiracy to puff up the importance of political journalists at the expense of law enforcement, cross-party political investigations, independent judiciary. Case closed. Next item.
But it's also, Mark, is it also, again, just to kick political journalists while they're down, is it also there's a bit of a conspiracy of silence as well, isn't it? Because the fact that Woodward and Bernstein are on All the President's Men, and again, this is mentioned in the film, the fact that they're quite junior reporters and none of the political reporters want to go near it. I mean, partly it's because the political reporters are on the presidential campaign beat. They're all with Hunter S. Thompson doing whatever it is you'd end up doing, losing several days at a time, I assume. But also means, they're all at swanky cocktail parties with Henry Kissinger, sort of assuming this can't possibly be true. But you mentioned the E. Howard Hunt and the fact that, I suppose, Watergate itself becomes grist to the mill for a lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories at the heart of politics. And the fact that that this is probably the main conspiracy there is in the heart of the US government in terms of an illegal conspiracy. And the fact is it comes out.
And I think it hugely poisons the public's view of politics because this is as sort of pretty much as big and as serious a conspiracy as you can imagine, particularly given all the multiple ramifications across, dirty tricks in all sorts of different ways. It's not just one thing being done wrong and being covered up. It's a whole systemized large-scale program of wrongdoing.
And some of them do sound so bizarre that you think they must not be true, like ordering loads of pizzas to Democratic campaign offices and all this sort of stuff, just bizarre. So that feels like a good segue, though, into the next item on the agenda, how to win an election, best and worst bits of political strategy. What piece of advice do you take from Richard Nixon in your campaigning, Mark?
Well, I mean, he did make a remarkable comeback in his political career and then go on to win 2 US presidential elections. But he may not be the best of people to take lessons from. So I'm going to dodge that one and say, actually, I think one of the most useful lessons is on the journalism side. As you said, I think the way the movie portrays Ben Bradley's role perhaps exaggerates it slightly, but fundamentally, the newspaper editor putting together the right team, getting the right pair of people to work together on the story and backing them up. There's a bit of team leadership and team building there that is so important in politics and, in sports and in life more generally. So I think leadership and teamwork is a big, big lesson to learn.
It's true for Woodward and Bernstein as well, isn't it? Because they complement each other quite well. And there's a nice bit at the start of the film. This is maybe a slight caricature, but the impression that you get from the book and the film is that Woodward had the contacts, but Carl Bernstein was the better writer. And they kind of do that quite well at the start of the film, where Bernstein picks up the copy that Woodward's written and takes it back and rewrites it. And Woodward goes, oh, yeah. I know you can tell that It's not quite that Robert Redford's spoiling for a fight, because I don't think Robert Redford isn't quite a spoiling for a fight kind of actor, but he's ready to get mildly irritated, and then reads it and goes, "Oh yeah, that's so much better." And I suppose that self-knowledge of knowing what you are good at, what you're not so good at, and then what you might need your partner to do in a podcast about, say, ranting for several hours about how all the President's Men is raided the Lost Ark. Like, it's good to know what one's complementary
Where
skill
the
sets
limits
are.
are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, in this case, you have control over the editing button and how much of that rant has stayed in, which neatly segues to the point about the famous but fictional quote to follow the money. That both in terms of if you're running a political campaign, you need to have proper control of who is spending the money and what it's being spent on. But also, if you are trying to understand whether it's a story that you're trying to investigate or a minister running a department, in all of those different sorts of scenarios, understanding the flow of money and who makes the decisions over money is really important. I mean, to take a completely different area of activity, think about local government devolution in England. Not an issue one normally associates with Watergate, but actually a big part of the limitations of the effectiveness of devolution to local government in England has been that control over the money, who is the person who has to sign off to authorise the expenditure, has not been decentralised in the same way as other elements of power apparently have. And so the control of the money ends up being, this gets back to obviously a theme that runs through many of the other shows, some of which we've talked about and some more of which we will doubtless talk about the grip of the Treasury in Britain. And in a sense, the committee to re-elect the president and the question about who's in control of the money there is quite analogous to that question about, is HM the Treasury too much in control of the money in the UK?
I'm trying to do a Rachel Reeves, John Mitchell comparison, but there's no way that any of that is... None of that, for so many reasons, can possibly get anywhere. There's also an interesting sort of political strategy about knowing what your opponents are up to and how to respond to it. And I think there's a phenomenon which is known as candidate-itis, which essentially
absolutely.
is a candidate can get very, very worried, understandably, about losing an election, especially in local government elections, which tend to be quite close, but not just there, where you know that elections are going to be run by a handful of votes. I know a few candidates who, if the opposition put out one leaflet, this becomes some terrible injustice, and kind of you could spend hours sort of worrying about it or ranting about it. And it's kind of how much to actually worry about what the opposition are saying, how much to respond, where you can often end up with a bit of a Streisand effect as well about, if you end up rebutting what the opposition have said, then you end up amplifying their argument. And I feel like Watergate itself is almost the biggest example of candidate-itis, where essentially that is institutionalized in a system that essentially assumes, well, the Democrats are bugging us, so we've got to bug them.
And were the Democrats bugging them?
I don't think so.
No.
Or if they were, then it hasn't
They were
come
doing
out.
it much better.
It was probably Terry Coverley, let's be honest. Jeez. If anyone's going to do anything covertly and not be noticed.
That is a challenging callback to check that listeners have got good memories and have been listening to every single episode.
Final thing I like, actually, also important. This is the first film I think we've watched in which door knocking takes place, because Woodward and Bernstein knock the doors of employees of the committee to re-elect the president to see if they'll dish the dirt. I like the fact they do introduce themselves and they say who they are and they say what they're representing. That's good door knocking etiquette. I think it's also true to life that the time in which a journalist is able to get information from a member of the public, it's when it's just one-on-one. I think it's really hard to knock doors when there's several of you at the door. I've seen all political parties do it with like 3 or 4 people at the door. It's a bit like carol singers. Like there's no way no useful information is going to come out. So I like that there's door knocking. That fills me with joy. Next item on the agenda, the Zeitgeist tape. Any production details to save it? I mean, there's loads to save it because this is
so many.
It's such a well-made film.
But the best is the Father Dougal parallel, because the stage set that absolutely dominates the movie is the Washington Post newsroom stage set that they put together, and it's a huge stage set. They get 200 desks in to populate the stage set, which gives you a sense of its scale. But even that isn't big enough, and so there's false perspective is used at the back of the stage set to make it look larger than it really is. And so things at the back of the stage set are deliberately slightly shrunken in size to fool you to think they're further away. But what does that mean you do for the extras who are appearing right at the back? You make sure your extras are shorter people. So you've got short people in the distance to look like they're further away than they really are, just like Father Dougal and the cows. It's a lovely, lovely production detail.
A more classic cinematic parallel might be Casablanca with the scene in the plane at the end, where I think again they haven't got a full size plane, have they? They've got smaller planes, so have to use shorter actors.
Yeah. You go for Casablanca, I go for Father Dougal.
It's like Woodward and Burnett. We were talking about complementary pairs before.
Exactly.
So,
I mean, there are so many other details. One detail, though, that I tried to savour but failed is there's a sign on Robert Redford's desk that looks like it's going to be quite a fun sign. And I couldn't see all of it at any point. I got as far as it does not matter how many mistakes one makes in politics, as long as one keeps making them, it is. And I couldn't see the rest of it. And so I did try asking several different LLMs if they could look up for me, find out what the rest of the quote is. And they were all disastrous. They all hallucinated like Billy-O with complete. So I quite deliberately only gave them some of the words that I knew so that I could check whether the words they came back with included the rest of the words that I had seen on screen. So I was able to spot their hallucinations. They were a complete failure. Anyone does know what the rest of that sign says, please do give us a bit of listener feedback that we can raise under Matters Arising next time and let me know. But it sounds like it should be a great quote.
I completely missed that because I saw in your notes it said sign on the desk, and I thought, do you just mean the names of the reporters? So tell you, there is a lot to read in this film. There's so many notes. I like Robert Redford's handwritten, or Bob Woodward's, I suppose, handwritten notes and the doodles he's making. They show checks on screen, they show typewritten things on screen. And so, yeah, it's a film you've kind of got to be concentrating all the way through, but also there are some really nice, well-made bits that you can see. So the lighting's also very good, isn't it?
Yeah, and I particularly like the lighting with Deep Throat in the car park, where especially the first time Woodward goes to meet him, and you get this little glint. I think it must be on spectacles rather than on his eyeball, but it sort of looks like it's a glint on his eyeball. And all the rest of his face really dark. And I don't know, deliberately or not, it seems like each time Deep Throat appears in the film, his face is slightly better lit, as if he's somehow coming out of the shadows.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that, but yeah, I can see that. Again, we talked in about 70s clothes in this house. Fans of 70s clothes will also have a lot to enjoy about this film. Robert Redford has an amazing range of mustard yellow to brown suits, whereas Dustin Hoffman essentially compensates by having massive collars. Some of the women in the film, especially a couple of secretaries, have amazing bouffant hair. Puts even Meryl Streep in The Iron Lady to shame with the bouffontness, if that's a word, which I suspect it probably isn't.
If it isn't, it should be. I mean, the other production element that really caught my eye was the clever use of focus. One of perhaps the most famous scenes in the film is just under 6 minutes of Robert Redford on the phone, talking to a series of people, talking through various financial transactions. And it's just the one shot is on him all the time. And it's obviously a brilliant bit of acting for him to make 6 minutes of him on a phone in close up talking about finance seem interesting and gripping. But what you have as well is some of the points in the shot, you can see the far corner of the office. And so you've got Robert Redford in close up trying to track down information to do with the Richard Nixon scandal, as on the television in the far corner of the office, the news is breaking about the Democrat VP candidate pulling out, partly the victim of dirty tricks. And all the other journalists in the office are congregating around the TV. And both elements are in focus. So both Robert Redford in the foreground and everyone else in the background are both in focus at the same time. Very clever bit of filmmaking.
I mean, that would have been really, really hard to do in 76, wouldn't
it? There's something about you can get this split focus lens that you put, you tilt over 90 degrees is somehow how they did it. Apparently, if you look at the lights in the ceiling and which ones are in focus and which ones are not, that's the clue as to how it was done. But that's getting well beyond my level of technical ability to understand.
Yeah, if you want to do a lampshade fictions podcast, then by all means
Yes.
shed some light on the subject. And there's so many great lingering shots of Robert Redford, Dustin Hoffman too, but especially Robert Redford on the phone. And I quite like the fact there's a couple of, I'm guessing they're actual bloopers which are kept in. So there's one where he is trying to speak to someone who's a Spanish speaker. So he kind of puts his hand over the mouthpiece and shouts, do any of you speaking? Oh, sorry. I mean, do any of you speak Spanish? And there's another one where he's talking to Kenneth Dahlberg, who's one of the accountants in the committee to re-elect the president, and calls him the wrong name. Says, "Thank you, Mr. McGregor, who we're speaking to before," and then corrects himself. And again, I think that was kept in because it sort of feels quite authentic, doesn't it?
And I think it is one of those films that is just fun to watch on streaming because you can pause, rewind, stare at the ceiling street lights to try and work out which ones are in focus and which ones are not, and therefore how the thing was shot. There's a lot to say. But I guess the one production detail that has maybe not aged quite so well is this lovely shot of Woodward and Bernstein is it the Congressional Library? They're in a library of some sort.
Yeah, I think
and they're
so.
searching through a whole load of paper records, and the camera sort of pans up above them and pulling further and further away above them, which these days would be relatively easy to do with a drone or something like that, I think. But at the time must have been quite a difficult shot to pull off.
And the typewriters as well. Didn't they use the sound of a rifle on the typewriter sound to make it sound louder?
Oh, yes. I think when you have text being typed and appearing up on screen, they enhanced the natural thump of the typewriter.
I love the fact that there's one morning, I think Bob Woodward's waking up and the news. So we've talked about a lot of the archive television footage, but I love the fact that on the radio, when Bob Woodward's waking up one morning, the news is about the Bobby Fischer Boris Baski World Chess Championship match of 1972, which was genuinely huge news as well in 1972. And this is
Was that the one where there were the allegations about secret messages in yogurt?
No, that's Karpov Korchnoi in 1978.
My mistake. Foolish of me to get the two muddled up.
Now, see, this is where I'm going to brutally edit down my 8-hour digression into Cold War chess championships.
And tell me, what was the chess opening like in that match? Was it one of your favourite openings that was used?
Well, it's interesting. So Fischer, I think, plays the Alekhine actually in one of them and surprises Spassky. There's a lot of Najdorfs and a lot of King's India defences. They're too theoretical. I can't be bothered to learn that many moves. But it's they talk about the game in which Fischer he forfeits the second game because he complains about the lighting and claims he's being distracted. But there are some chess-based Cold War political fictions that we could add to the list. Someone should do a film on the Karpov Korchnoi World Championship match in 1978 where they're complaining about secret messages in yogurt, they're kicking each other under the table. And again, there's a whole political angle there because Karpov was a Communist Party member, Korchnoi is a defector. Right.
Well, and then when you get the Karpov-Kasparov never-ending match cancelled, then suddenly politics all over the... I was going to say FIFA, but it's not FIFA. Was it FIDE?
FIDE, yeah.
FIDE. Politics all over FIDE, the chess body's interventions in the rules partway through that to protect their favourite candidate.
Right, we are a long way from Watergate now, aren't we? So we better get back. I think
actually there's one other little detail that's not really a production detail, but I just like that's worth mentioning. I've mentioned how this Watergate building security guard is the real security guard. The door is the real door. And the reason that the security guard spotted there was something wrong with the door was because what the burglars had been into the building once before, and they kept the door open by putting some tape over the latch so the latch couldn't shut, and so the door shut but it didn't lock. And obviously any hardened criminal listening to this will know the way you want to put the tape over the latch is you want to do it vertically, so you can have a nice narrow strip of tape that does the job, but when the door's shut there's no protruding excess of tape that anyone can see to be suspicious about. But on their return trip to the Watergate Centre, somebody else did the tape, and they did the tape horizontally, and that's how they got caught. So one could say that a misplaced piece of sticky tape is what triggered the Watergate crisis, the fall of Richard Nixon, the collapse in public trust in government in the US, the rise of right-wing populist forces in the US playing out through several generations and culminating in Donald Trump, all down to the one piece of sticky tape being placed the wrong way on a door in the early 1970s.
The crazy thing is that's not even the only unfortunate tape that's let loose in the Nixon administration in that scandal. State of play. This isn't the kind of film that you can watch with beer and pizza with friends. This is one where you really have, I think, to be concentrating, which I realise makes it sound like it's a bit of a punishment, but it's more. It's very absorbing. Like
you want to enjoy all the detail. So I think you could watch it with friends, but only if you all agree you all are going to love every little detail, and therefore you're going to sit in complete silence.
That's how I spend all my time with my friends anyway. So
you too, surprise.
but yes, so this is not if you've had a long day at work and you just want to open a bottle of wine and unwind. Not the film. However, if you want a completely absorbing, really gripping window into the 70s, it demands a lot of attention, but it's worth it. It's slick, it's well made, lots of great political detail. We're rating all of our films out of 650 to match the size.
And we're not going to convert to a US Electoral College size scoring system for this. We are sticking with the authorised and correct British scoring system.
The mother of parliaments, Mark.
Absolutely. I want to watch the film again. I also want to go and watch again The Final Days, which is sort of the sequel that covers the final part of the Nixon administration. I can see how there could be a better film. So I think I'm going to give it a 523 landslide, but with a little bit of room for something else at some point to sneak in with a higher score.
That's someone who's not satisfied, isn't it? 523 seats and still...
Yeah, 523 out of 650. That's my score. What are you going to give it as a score?
510.
Ooh, a bit lower. A bit lower.
Yeah, I was surprised at that. So, but better than an election, but not quite.
Better than that? That's heresy.
I realised. No, I should have finished my thought. Better than an election, but... Cue a second longer rant from Mark about my terrible taste in films.
And I guess on balance, it's a bit more fun to watch than some reruns of old episodes of Crossroads. Yeah, I'll go with that.
But I've given it a lower score than The Thick of It. But I think because I enjoyed watching The Thick of It more, if that makes sense. And I would rewatch The Thick of It.
Yeah.
Again, maybe that tells you the sort of frivolous mood that I was in. But it's very, very good. And we should definitely do The Final Days. We can add that to the list. Our never-ending list of political fictions.
I think even if we up the tempo of this podcast to daily episodes, we're still going to be falling behind. Our list is growing too quickly.
We should then move on before we think of any other things we can talk about. But if you want to keep abreast of our next episode, you don't have to break into a house and plant bugging devices. What can you do instead, Mark?
You can subscribe to our podcast feed in your favourite or least favourite podcast app. And if you have liked listening, please do post a review or a comment, because that really does help the show get seen by more people. Brackets, probably that's what every podcaster says, but the actual evidence that's true is a bit iffy, but it definitely helps feed our egos if you leave nice high ratings or reviews. So go on, be nice to us.
Don't do things that are academically proven to work. That's the lesson of this podcast. Putting these out fortnightly at the moment. What are we talking about in 2 weeks' time?
We are talking about Borgen. We are going to watch the Borgen episode all about Greenland, which has become horribly relevant again. I think at the time, Greenland was probably picked as a slightly absurd example to safely use, but sadly, that's not how events have turned out. I have completely forgotten what happens in the episode, so I'm really looking forward to watching it again. Hopefully, listeners are looking forward to hearing what you and I make of it.
Speak to you then.
Take care.